This is Duke University.
This is where the site is, just outside of Johannesburg. And it's a World Heritage Site called the Cradle of Humankind. And there are a number of cave sites which have produced human fossils in the cradle. Some of the more famous are Swartkrans and Sterkfontein, which are visible from the new site, Rising Star, which is down there in the lower left corner. And just by way of comparison, at Swartkrans, the site has been excavated for 65 years, and they have found 300 human fossils in 65 years. Sterkfontein is excavated year-round. They have excavation crews that work 40-hour weeks for 65 years. They found 400 human fossils. And in 3 weeks underground at Rising Star, we pulled 1,500 human fossils out of the cave, and there's tens of thousands more in there. So it really is, just in the sheer volume of human fossils, it's really, really remarkable. You can sort of think about human evolution in terms of adaptive plateaus. And there's kind of a period, I hate to use the term ape man because it sounds like really like, I don't know, Victorian, or it sounds like sort of old school thinking about human evolution. But the Australopiths are kind of really that ape man adaptive phase in human evolution. And there are a bunch of species that we know that range in age from about 400 up to really about 2 million years ago. They go extinct, although some hang on a little bit longer. And they're like walking apes. They have small brains. Their brains are really not much bigger than a chimpanzee, just slightly. They are about the size of chimpanzees, common chimpanzees. They have adaptations which suggest that they're still climbing trees a lot. And really the only thing that you would notice about them is that they habitually walked on 2 legs. And then by about 1.5 million years ago, we have Homo erectus, which is represented by this our partial skeleton on the early Homo plateau. And if you saw Homo erectus walking around, you would recognize it as, you would see it as recognizably human. Larger body, elongated lower limbs, the climbing adaptations are gone, the brains are bigger, faces and teeth are smaller, dedicated tool user, whole bunch of adaptive shifts. And so this is a really interesting time in human evolution, but we don't have a lot of fossils that tell us about that change in adaptive plateau. We have no idea how old it is. We have absolutely no idea how old it is. It could be 10,000 years old. It could be 3 million years old. So we don't actually know where it fits in the big picture of human evolution. But we can say that anatomically, it looks like it fits right at that step from the Australopithecus plateau to the early Homo plateau. It has 1 foot on the Australopithecus plateau. In some respects, it is very Australopith-like. Its brain is still really small. A bit bigger than most of the other Australopiths, but we're talking about 450 to 550 cubic centimeters. Our brains are about 1350 on average. So really an ape-sized brain. We still see an upper limb which is well adapted for climbing. We see a trunk which looks very ape-like. It suggests it still has a fairly large gut like a chimpanzee. But the lower limbs are elongated. The foot is very modern. Aspects of the hand are very modern, and aspects of the dental apparatus are very modern. So it really looks like it is an organism that is somewhere in the middle of that adaptive shift. So that's one of the things that's really exciting about it. This is often the case when you announce a new species, particularly in hominid paleontology, is that some people will accept it and others will say it's just a variant of something that we already know. Because populations are variable, they're variable in space, and they're certainly variable in time, and we're sampling those populations in different places and at different times. And so the question becomes, how different does something need to be before we can say, okay, it's a new species versus something that we already know from the fossil record? And some of our colleagues look at the anatomy of the skull, particularly the dentition, and say this is really just a variant of Homo erectus, particularly an early form of Homo erectus, which is picked up in the Republic of Georgia at a site called Dmanisi. And we in fact noted that this thing shares a lot of similarities with early Homo erectus from Dmanisi. First off, I should point out that some of these parts are articulated. The hand that you see there all comes from one individual. The foot that you see there, the right foot, all comes from one individual. But the rest of that skeleton that you see there is a composite because the remains are jumbled right now. It looks like bodies were dropped down a shaft and they accumulated at the bottom of the shaft, but periodically through time that chamber filled with water and then water drained out through cracks in the lower part of the chamber. And so there was some water reworking. And as we've only scratched the surface, and as we seem to be getting deeper, we're getting stuff that's in articulation. So we think that there's going to be parts that we know for sure go together as we get down there. So we have to be careful because we've got just about every part of the skeleton represented, but we have to admit that we don't know which bones go with which other bones back into individuals. But it is the case that a lot of finds, particularly in East Africa where they're working in a very different context, are isolated bones. And what we've seen here and what we saw in another hominin that we found in South Africa, Australopithecus sediba, is these things are mosaics. They look very modern in some features and very primitive in other features, and that it's probably unwise to say too much about a hominin from one part of them. But Lee Berger, who's sort of I call him the front man for the band. He's the guy who basically runs the project. He's always admonishing us, we can't be fossil bullies. We can't, because we're sitting on a lot of fossils, we can't basically say, oh, well, what you guys say doesn't matter because you don't have as much as we have, and we can say so much more because we have so much more. So it's a little bit of something we struggle with. It is the most homogeneous assemblage of fossil hominins I've ever seen in my life. We appear to have two size morphs in the adults, which we're assuming are males and females. But the males look exactly like just slightly bigger versions of the female specimens. And we made a little composite cranium because we had different parts of the cranium and we surface scanned them and fit them together. And it required they overlapped like they were twins. It's amazing how homogeneous this assemblage is. It is really, really amazing. This is what makes this chamber so special. Is it's only hominins. There's no other animals. There's no carnivore involvement. There's no tooth marks, carnivore damage on the bones. And they're all enormously homogeneous. I'm so proud to be part of this project, and for reasons that have nothing to do with my contribution, but just to be associated with the project. So the fossils were first discovered by these two guys on the left, Rick Hunter on the bottom and Steve Tucker on the top. And they had been asked by Pedro Boshoff, who works with us. He was a graduate student with us a while back and works with us. And he's a local caver. And he asked cavers that he knew to be on the lookout for fossils in some of the cave sites. And so while exploring the Rising Star cave system, Rick and Steve found themselves in a chamber which had been visited at least once before by cavers. We found a survey pin and footprints down there, but it looks like maybe only once, and it's very, very difficult to get to. It requires negotiating a 30-foot vertical squeeze, which gets down to about 7 inches in places. They knew not to collect anything because they knew we had to have permits. But they took photographs in the chamber, and this is one of the photographs that they brought out of the cave, which got us enormously excited. So we needed people that had excavation experience. We were looking for people who had at least a master's in anthropology or paleontology, but we also needed people who had caving or rock climbing experience. We knew that the circumstances were going to be very dangerous because if somebody got hurt in that chamber, we weren't going to be able to extract them easily. So we wanted people preferably who had some emergency medical training. And they had to be willing to work in dangerous and claustrophobic conditions, and they had to be small enough to get down into the chamber. And so our solution was to kind of crowdsource it, and there's a paleoanthropology Facebook page, and we just put out the call on that Facebook page and said, hey, we need help, we need some people. And about 57 people from around the world applied for the job, and these 6 women were the best qualified of all the candidates that we got. And their lives were turned upside down because within about a week of applying, they were packing their bags and coming to South Africa. The fossils were found on October 1st of 2013, and the first week of November we had the expedition in place, about 50 people on the ground with National Geographic funding to bring these things out. But we only allocated 3 weeks because we thought we had a single skeleton in there. We thought we were bringing a single associated skeleton up out of the chamber. And by day 1, we knew we had multiple individuals. But these women worked in like the most dangerous and uncomfortable circumstances that you can imagine. And they did a remarkable job. And I'm happy to say that 4 of them have stayed on with the scientific team and are authors on the publications that are coming out now. 2 others have gone on to do other things in related fields. I'm also happy to say that the South African caving community got behind this project in a big way. They came out in droves to provide support. So whenever we were working in the chamber, we had cavers from South Africa who were at different places in the cave to basically ensure safety, to help with some of the technical work, because it involved a fairly dangerous climb and technical climb up something called the Dragon's Back. The cavers ran our video feeds, they ran our communication lines, they monitored CO2 in the cave. So it was really just, they took ownership of the project, and it was just really a great, great project. The question is, how do we get the remains of about 15 individuals down in this deep chamber in the cave? And the context is completely unlike any other cave in South Africa. In the other cave sites, we always have a mix of other animals and human remains. And in the other cave sites, with one exception, there's evidence of carnivore involvement. That all of the animals, including the little early humans, were killed by carnivores, and they were brought into the cave by carnivores. Here we have no involvement of carnivores. We can tell that the chamber was always in the dark portion of the cave. It is very, very difficult to get to, and we can rule out every scenario for how those hominins got in the chamber except one, which is that something was putting them there. And the most parsimonious explanation, and we're getting a lot of pushback from the field because people do not like this, is that they were disposing of their dead in that chamber. That they were, as you see in this National Geographic illustration, they were carrying dead bodies, dragging them through tortuous chambers. It's not easy to get there, and dumping them down a vertical shaft, and they were accumulating at the bottom of that shaft. We have referred to this as ritual behavior, not because we mean to imply that there's some sort of, ceremony or ritualistic belief or whatever, but because we can tell they were doing it over time. There are a couple of distinct deposits in the bottom of the chamber, and we've got fossils in the deposits, so we know it wasn't a single time thing. So we know that repeatedly, so that's what we mean by ritually. They were repeatedly disposing of bodies in there. And these things have got a brain, as my colleague John Hawke so eloquently put it, about the size of a navel orange. And that makes us question, we think of disposal of the dead as a very human behavior, and we think of it as being wrapped up with thoughts about, an understanding of death, thoughts of the afterlife, reflection of social bonds, and that a little critter with basically an ape-sized brain, that they were engaging in something like that, has not sat very well with our colleagues in anthropology. When a social group member dies, they have an issue of body disposal, because you don't want the body decomposing and drawing carnivores, attracting predators and whatnot. So it could be as simple as body disposal, that it's a practical solution. They seem to be going to some effort, though, because the cave is very tortuous. It's about the length of 2 football fields from the entrance to the chamber. The geologists are quite certain there's never been an opening closer. There are no external sediments in the chamber. All of the sediments in the chamber are derived from the cave, whereas the next chamber over, that has got the dragons back in it, has got clast, rocks, pebbles, and stuff from the outside. So we can tell that chamber has never had an opening, that stuff has fallen in or been thrown in or anything. So they appear to be going to some trouble. It could also be simply a reflection of social bonds, that these guys see what happens when a social group member dies and gets left on the surface, and the next thing you know, hyenas are picking it apart, and that distresses them. And so they're going to efforts to make sure that doesn't happen. There are some implications here, which, if we're right about the purposeful body disposal, one implication is that they had fire, because this is not a cave that you can navigate in the dark. Some caves are fairly simple, and you can just feel the wall and work your way into the dark and sort of stumble along and then work your way back out. But this is a very, very torturous, very tight cave, which involves a lot of climbing up and over and squeezing down and squeezing through. And it's work to get back in there. And I cannot imagine getting your way in there, repeatedly finding that chamber and dropping bodies in there and getting out without some form of light. So that's remarkable. The other thing is, depending on the length of time over which these bodies were deposited, if it's a substantial length of time, we're talking about culture. We're talking about a behavioral practice which was repeated over a substantial amount of time, and that's culture. We know that orangutans and we know that chimpanzees engage in rudimentary culture. They have behavioral traditions that vary from place to place and that seem to extend through time. So it's really not that remarkable that these guys might be also engaging in some cultural behavior. But again, people aren't going to like that idea that this 450 to 550 cc brain thing is cultural animal. There's a great debate about when hominins actually really began to use fire, and there are some people who think it's very late in human evolution, maybe not until 400,000 or even 200,000 years ago. And there are others who argue that it goes back at least 1.5 million to Homo erectus. And some of that evidence for early use of fire comes from the cave across the street, Swartkrans, where they have bones which have been burned. The calcination to the bone requires long-term heating in a hot fire, and experimental work shows that a brush fire won't give you that kind of calcination, and it really looks like these things were exposed to a long burning fire. One thing is the hand really seems to have some derived features which we interpret as being related to fine manipulation and also to resisting the kind of forces that are generated, the reaction forces that are generated during flint knapping. And again, we don't know the age of this thing, but even if it's 2 million, 2.5 million years old, there are stone tools in the archaeological record that may go back 3.3 million. So, and that's certainly cultural behavior of a kind. That's material culture, and these are traditions which seem to go down through time. The other thing that's interesting is that the teeth are smaller than you see in the Australopiths, and the chewing muscles are smaller. And that suggests to us a higher quality diet. And one thing that's characteristic of humans today, if you look at human foragers, is that they are, I would define the human niche as extractive foragers of high quality resources. We're very, very good at getting good quality resources, resources which are rich in, brain important fats, rich in calories, out of embedded matrices, digging them up out of the ground or getting them out of the inside of bones or whatever. And so the changes to the chewing apparatus suggest that these guys are going down that path. Is that cultural? I don't know, but I would certainly say it's probably technologically assisted behavior. If we're looking at just a messy kind of incomplete lineage sorting, I don't have intellectual tools to even know what the interesting questions to ask are right now. This is why I'm reeling from this, because I don't even now know what the good questions are. Our geologists who are working in there said the system is erosional. Periodically there's water flow through the chamber, it's draining out through cracks in the lower part of the chamber, and those bones will be destroyed over time. So that kind of gave us the green light to say, okay, we need to go in and extract the rest of the bones. But it is so difficult to work in that chamber. It is such a process to bring bones up out of there. So that's something that we have to deal with. We're still working at our other site in Malapa, and we still have cavers now who are exploring and finding more stuff. So,
how do you protect the site?
Well, I think that's also been a real success story, because when the call went out to the Caving Association in South Africa for help with the expedition, we had an outpouring of cavers. They were there in droves every day. They did the dangerous work of support, and they were there at the announcement. That gives us great confidence that, first off, we've now enlisted, hundreds of allies in the search for fossil remains in these caves, because these guys now, every cave they go in, they're attuned to the fossil background that they're seeing. And secondly, they're all attuned to the need to preserve and treat these things right. We're trying to use this project, as well as our work at Malapa, to leverage a bit of change in the way that paleoanthropology is done, because it is conventionally a very closed, good old boy network where field work is done in secret, finds are kept secret. They're often, researchers sit on them for years and years and years before publishing. And then even after publication, it can be hard to see the fossils or even see casts of them. And so we are basically trying to change all that. We made the expedition public. There was a National Geographic live blogger on the expedition from day one, and videos were posted of what we were doing, and the world kind of followed along. And our cavers were getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to Skype with third grade classes in Oklahoma. I mean, it was, I thought, just a wonderful, wonderful experiment in open science. Once we had these 1,500 fossils, we sort of said, okay, well, how are we going to deal with this just huge amount of fossils? And there's going to be more that come out of the cave. We're still working at our other site, Malapa. There's still material coming out of there. And, we're already stretched thin. So what we did was we, again, put out a call for early career stage scientists, which we defined as anyone who was almost but not yet PhD, so people who were in the sort of write-up stage or late stages of dissertation, all the way up to not yet tenure. And we raised $2.5 million, and we brought them down to South Africa. About 50 early career stage scientists. You see a portion of the group here working in the hominid fossil vault at the University of the Witwatersrand. And our criteria were that you have to have useful data, and you have to be willing to share that data, and you have to be a collaborative person. And So a lot of our colleagues are saying, well, we rushed to publication, we didn't adequately study the stuff, and we can document, there's about 10,000 person hours went into the study of these fossils, which is way more than most assemblages get before they're published. We also have an open access policy. Any of our collaborators or our colleagues, whether they disagree with us or not, are welcome to come see these bones. If you think we're wrong about anything, we'll do our best to give you what you need to prove us wrong, because we think that's the way that science should be done. And so once we got rejected by Nature, rather than going to the journal Science or some other journal that's behind paywalls, we thought that going to an open access journal was sort of fit with the philosophy. The other thing that I'll say that we've done, MorphoSource is a Duke-hosted platform for sharing three-dimensional images of fossils. And we've published about 80 3D files of about 80 of the naledi specimens on MorphoSource, and anybody can go and download them and 3D print them. And we've had people who, on the day we announced, printed casts and took them to their classes. And we're really proud of that. That paper has had 14,000 downloads since Thursday. And there are not 14,000 scientists who are interested in this story. So that tells us that the public is downloading the article. And the public they're the ones who are funding this work. They're the ones who should be, they should be able to open up and read any scientific paper anywhere.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.